In this episode of the podcast, we talked to Derrick Reimer about building Level as an SPA. He uses Elm on the front end and Elixir and Phoenix on the back end with the GraphQL API, and I think a lot of this discussion is relevant for Ember developers, so I hope you enjoy it. Awesome. And you're recording?
I'm recording.
Sweet. Well, why do you want this job at Google today?
Well, I just think I'm really well qualified. I'm the best qualified candidate.
All right, well, we're going to have you sort a tree, and all you have to use is your fingernail and this whiteboard.
The answer is 2 million.
We're hiring you. Re-implement Google.
We'll use Elm.
We want to have you on the podcast today to kind of wrap up our conversation from a year ago.
Yeah.
So we've been following your work. For folks who don't know, you have a podcast where you're talking about this really cool product you're building. It's called Level.
Yeah.
And it's just been really fun hearing you talk about some of the technical challenges, the product challenges over the last year on your podcast, which is The Art of Product. And when we first met last year, we kind of had this epic architecture conversation.
Yeah.
So like 3 a.m.
Yep.
Because with Ember we've been kind of doing SPA development, and so we've seen certain patterns, and like we have a way of doing things now, and it's interesting because I feel like Ember was kind of trying to do this from the beginning.
Yeah.
And then React came out and Vue came out, and they have this kind of progressive story, but now we're seeing more people do SPAs, and then Elm is kind of like basically SPAs as well.
Yep.
So yeah, we thought it'd be fun to get together today and just talk about that.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. Where should we start?
I don't know.
Why don't you tell us a little about Level?
Sure. Yeah,
Set the stage.
So Level is an alternative to real-time chat tools like Slack, designed to really help teams achieve deep focus, and deep work. So if you've ever used a chat tool before at work, you've probably been barraged with notifications at various times. You've maybe found it difficult to look away from it and not constantly clear the little red dot on the app icon, kind of beckoning you to come back and see what the latest is. And I think there's really like kind of a societal problem right now in that many of us are living in a constant state of distraction, whether we realize it or not. We're looking at our phones all the time. We're checking social media, and so I got the idea for Level just from being in a really busy Slack team, or in multiples of them really, and just kind of realizing that like our tools can be doing a better service to us, helping us like steer clear of bad habits, and helping instill a little bit more values of like being patient and being more mindful about when we interrupt our coworkers, and being a little more just thinking about planning in advance instead of everything kind of being chaotic, hair on fire, handle it in real time. And so that's kind of the premise.
That's an awesome pitch. It's kind of like maybe if you always try to optimize for engagement, you're not going to end up with the best tool for doing the kind of work that you want to prioritize.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, I would love to do a whole episode on the product because it's just been fun. Like, seems like this is a mission that you believe in.
Yeah.
When you started, you took time to write this kind of manifesto where you outlined some of the symptoms you saw at your last job and why this is important to you to solve. So, yeah, that's a really cool kind of setting the stage for the product. So, our conversation last year was like, had you started working on Level yet?
I had just broken ground on it, and I think like the prior 6 months, I was just experimenting with some new technologies that I thought about using for it. So previously, I was in like a traditional Ruby on Rails stack with kind of jQuery, and like over the years we had some Backbone in there. We had some, the whole boulevard of broken JavaScript frameworks, and ultimately landed at like we were using Twitter Flight, which is like Twitter's like it predated React, I think, by a little bit, and it was kind of their approach to components, and it never took off. But
we just actually met someone using that, didn't we? We were talking to someone here, and I think their whole app uses Flight.
How funny.
So
I mean, hopefully they weren't inspired by Drip, because I think I talked about it at the time a little bit. But it actually worked. It worked decently well. Probably these days, like I would maybe look towards like a stimulus JS or something like that,
Right.
where really you're just kind of like, I wanted to be able to take like a tightly scoped component and bind it to a certain piece of the DOM and add some interactivity. And that was mostly what we needed at Drip, because it was not a single page application. It was a traditional, server rendered app, and just needed to sprinkle on some stuff. So that was what I was coming out of. And, with Level being a communication tool, I knew it was going to need to be really interactive. Like if someone is looking on their screen, they need updates to flow in real time. The UI needs to always be kind of up to date with the state of the world. And probably will eventually want to have some offline support, at least read-only support, to be able to look at stuff if you're on an airplane. Mm-hmm. And it needed to be lightning fast. So being able to hold data, in memory in the browser and be able to present that immediately to the user when they switch through pages was going to be really important too. Mm-hmm. And so that all those things combined kind of led me down the route of wanting to do an SPA, but I had zero experience with it. So I spent 6 months-ish prior, just kind of nights and weekends playing around with different technologies. And a friend of mine introduced me to Elm, and I really kind of became enamored with the type system and kind of the way the Elm architecture works. And I think they do a really good job of marketing it to I guess a particular type of developer who's maybe a little burned out by JavaScript frameworks and kind of churn in the ecosystem. And so that really spoke to me, because having chosen a framework like Flight that
Only to have it
not be the one that was the winner.
Right.
And just worried. Like I had friends who went through like the Angular 1, Angular 2 debacle, and
right.
like, I don't know, just so many of us I think feel burned out by the JavaScript ecosystem, for better or worse.
Yep.
So that really spoke to me. And so I had been, at the time last MicroConf, I had been playing around with it for a bit and kind of prototyping stuff.
That's really cool to see like the positioning of Elm and saying it's about fighting the churn, and we're investing in the long term, and it's you don't really see that as a marketing position for lots of the frameworks. Usually the focus of a new framework is on what novel technique are they bringing, or and I also think Elm's had a big influence on the wider JavaScript ecosystem, just by making some of the ideas from functional languages really accessible to modern JavaScript developers. I know like Redux had a lot of influence from the same patterns that are in Elm, and that's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's like you said, it kind of the thing that especially attracted me about it is it's both a language and kind of a framework. Like you don't use a framework in Elm world, so it's just you're buying into kind of an ecosystem.
It's not like Phoenix and Elixir.
Right.
It's just Elm.
Right.
But Elm is everything you need.
Yes.
From that sense.
Yep.
Now, how does that work? Does Elm have like the primitives to build an SPA, or does Elm have a bunch of libraries that you...
It basically has the primitives built in, and especially with the 0.19 release, there were a bunch of missing pieces kind of around routing and just some of those like key pieces that you need for really a smooth experience with an SPA. Like before 0.19, most people used hash routing because the push state type of stuff was not kind of baked into the Elm architecture. But 0.19 had a bunch of improvements around that, and so now you kind of like instantiate your Elm application and you tell it, I want this to be a particular type of application where it's going to be in charge of the routing, and it just kind of, it kind of is baked into the Elm runtime.
And that's like if I were to start a new Elm app today, I would get that. I would be nudged towards using the router and everything like that?
Not necessarily. So Elm is actually, a lot of people use it for traditional server rendered applications, and they just, certain parts of the page that need to be highly interactive. So you can, and I think React is kind of similar, right? Where you can just kind of say like this part of the page.
A carousel, but maybe the rest of the page is rendered by Rails or something like that.
Yep. So there is like I just want to like take a div and make that give Elm control of this div, mm-hmm. or you can say I want it to have control of the whole page and the routing.
Nice.
Yeah.
It occurred to me like when you were first talking about the architecture based on the needs of the product, one way to categorize like when you switch over from kind of like a traditional architecture to like, okay, I need a SPA, is basically if you need the the UI to update, not as a result of the current user's
Yeah.
interactions. I mean, that makes sense. Like we talk about this all the time, but it's, if you think about it in a traditional app, the user can click links and they can submit forms, and that's it. And so that's really the only time they're going to see new data on the page.
Yeah.
But this comes up a lot in like SPA development and Ember, because you can be looking at like cached data and it can get stale. And like once you click a link, you'll see the fresh. But really, if you're building an app like this, you kind of have to think about all that stuff up front.
Yeah.
And say, you know, if someone else posts a message, even if the user's idle,
Yep.
how are we going to get that data onto the screen?
Yeah.
So I want to get into that. I want to get into like the details of that.
Yeah.
But first, I kind of wanted to ask, like, you're basically making two apps with this architecture, right? So how, out of the 30,000-foot view, like how is that compared to how productive you felt in your last environment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's hard to answer that question because I had experience with Rails prior. I've been building apps in it for a number of years, and this is all new to me. So it has been a little bit painful. I mean, it's been fun learning a new stack, but also while trying to get like an MVP product built and, you know, trying not to spend too much time learning how to, you know, perfectly use this tech stack. So it has been, I definitely took a performance hit on my productivity, just learning how all the pieces fit together. And there's, like Elm is not super opinionated, I guess, in the way you architect things. I mean, it's actually pretty simple when you look at it. It's just like you have a model that holds your state, and you know, you can nest data structures within that as you wish. You can use dictionary objects, or dictionary data structures, or lists, or, you know, store strings or booleans. Like you just get all the primitive types in there. But it's really kind of up to you to figure out how to kind of like manage the state around what page you're on versus kind of global shared state, and how all those pieces fit together. There are some nice resources. Richard Feldman has a Elm SPA example app, and that helped me a ton in just figuring out like the right way to architect pages and pass messages, you know, kind of downstream to a module that has all the page logic from your main program module, and like the way to structure that. So things like that helped me a ton. I would have taken much longer if I didn't have those resources.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it's Elm, and then it's Phoenix on the back end, and then GraphQL.
Yes.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the new things.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because I've written before about like choosing tech stacks, and I've always been a very much a proponent of choose what you know. Like you can
Pragmatic.
Yeah, you
approach.
you can probably make do with something, you know, like use that as a major factor in choosing something. So I kind of broke my own rules on this.
What led? I mean, there must have been something that led you towards this. So what?
So I'd also started exploring Elixir just purely out of like I love programming languages, and I like programming it's both my hobby and my work, you know. So it was kind of just a passion of mine. I wanted to look into it. A lot of Rubyists kind of head that direction. It was created by Jose Valim, who was on the Rails core team for a long time. So it very much has a lot of the same values that the Ruby and Rails communities have. But I think it was kind of born out of some of his maybe frustrations with performance in Ruby land.
Which you had also had some experience with at Drip.
Yeah, totally. So
You saw the darkness there.
yeah.
that you could see not wanting to go back to.
Right. And like, so the thing that really pushed me over the edge in this case was like, you know, Elixir is built on top of Erlang. Erlang was created by Ericsson, I believe, the telecom company, and it powers a lot of text messaging infrastructure and WhatsApp, and so it's built for high concurrency.
Right.
And not that I expect to be that scale anytime soon, but it doesn't hurt that, like, you know, it's kind of baked into the virtual machine to be able to handle concurrency and isolated processes for individual sessions and things like that. So
super cool.
Yeah.
All the buzzwords. I love it. It's I kind of am jealous.
Yeah.
That's cool. So why don't we kind of dive into some of the details? Because I'm very curious to hear, what it's been like building the SPA and everything.
Yeah.
Maybe we could start with like the data stuff.
Sure.
So you said basically you use Elm objects or dictionaries, and if you have something like a post, So you were just showing us the product, and basically the home page of a channel looks a lot like a channel in Slack, where you kind of have the channels list over here, and then you have the current channel with all the messages and from each different author. So you have like relationship data here, relational data with like messages that belong to posts. You have messages that are, users, and the channels as well. Yep. The channels list is persistent as you navigate around, like just this part is repainting. But you also have to know if there's like new messages in the other channels, because that part changes. So kind of at a high level, how do you think about the data and getting updates and all that kind of thing?
Yeah. So I'll touch on GraphQL. So I arrived on that as the API layer, and that was also born out of my kind of frustration with crafting the drip API. Like I feel like it's a good API. It's kind of just using RESTful principles, and it was modeled after an early version of JSON API actually. Like before it got, I think the spec got rewritten a few times, but it was just like I was desperate for something to give me like some kind
Someone
of
who has
standard
thought through all the different possibilities.
Yeah, like I don't want to just go and try to come up with best practices for this, but REST APIs are just so flexible, and for better or worse.
For worse.
So like the idea of GraphQL, which is basically you define a schema and it has types. So and it's all well defined. You can most like GraphQL libraries, you document your API right alongside. Like it's kind of all just baked into the library, and that's part of the GraphQL schema, which then can be, you can use the graphical tool, which is the one that Facebook created, for exploring it. So you automatically get full API documentation and the ability to like use basically a console in the web browser to run queries.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So almost like a Rails like admin or a Rails console.
Yeah.
For your API.
Totally.
That's amazing.
And so I actually have that. I expose a route on Level today. Like you can just go to level.app/graphical, and if you're authenticated, you get to just run GraphQL queries against your own data.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that was very appealing. And so then I started to look closer at it, and I was like, okay, don't, try not to be too enamored with a shiny object, but let's give this thing a fair shake. And I think it was around the same time, like GitHub had adopted it for their V3 API, Shopify was using it. So like, it looks like this is not just a Facebook thing, like others are kind of catching on to this. So I started to look closer at it, and it just so happens there's a fantastic library for Elixir called Absinthe that has like just a really nice DSL for defining your queries and your mutations and subscriptions. And so it's kind of those three pieces. So queries in GraphQL, you basically you tell the API what data you want. So if you want back a user, but you don't need all the fields, all the possible fields it exposes, you say like in your query, I want this user and these fields, and it gives it back to
ID and name.
Yep.
And that's it. And even if they have 20 other attributes, doesn't matter.
Right.
Cool.
And you can say, I want a user and I want all of that user's messages or subscribed channels. And so then you can kind of, hence the graph part of GraphQL, you can ask for these related resources in one query. And so that was also really attractive. So
you mentioned subscribe channels. Is that something that's a part of Level, that's actually like a part of the domain of Level?
Yeah, so there are users, there are channels, and then there's the relationship between them. So you can,
So a subscribe channel is like a join record between the two.
Yeah.
And then over GraphQL, like you would be able to just get that, and what would that look like? The query would be user and then subscribe channels. So that's like its own model.
Yep.
And then you can get fields from that.
Right.
And then you could also get the actual channel through that as well.
Yep. And there's some patterns around. I think it's like React Relay maybe that kind of established some of these patterns, but like you have total flexibility in GraphQL to define your like list-based connections and pagination and stuff like that. But they have kind of these things they call connections, and with a connection, you can pass it your cursors for where in the list you want, and your limits. Do you want the first in the set or the last in the set?
Oh, interesting.
And then it gives you back an array, which is the edges.
I was going to say it's the edges thing. Cool, very cool.
Edges. And then each node is the actual thing that you're paginating over. And also you can get a cursor back for that, and you can get a total count. So there's kind of like a convention
Like a
around
linked list or something like that?
It's like metadata, right? It's like metadata about the relationship.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Do you ever find yourself putting other stuff, like, the standard like cursor, count, next thing? Do you find yourself putting like domain specific data in there?
Well, it is evolving. So actually something I'm working through right now is trying to figure out like how to effectively synchronize portions of my database with my front end. And it's still an evolving story for me today. Like, and especially as I'm looking towards getting closer to offline support and more towards like caching things more aggressively that I know can be cached. And
The channel lists, let's say.
And persisting those things between between even hard refreshes of the page and stuff like that. I'm kind of edging my way closer to that. I started out with just like every time you change the page, it literally loaded a fresh copy of everything from the server as if you had just done a fresh load.
And it would do a whole query, even for things like the channels.
Yeah.
Okay, I see. Just to start off.
That was
to get it working.
that was step one.
Absolutely.
Like treat every page as its own isolated thing.
Did you, with the JavaScript app, also reinitialize?
No.
Okay.
So short of doing that, but like
the data though.
The data though.
You like throw away the old data and just render straight from the query, basically.
Because every page needs to know, like if you just hit a route and it is a fresh load, freshly initialized the Elm app, it needs to know how to fetch all the data it needs to at least present, part of the page to you at that moment. So
it's funny because you don't think about it. With a traditional architecture, you get the reload each time. There's only one way to render the page.
Yeah.
But now with an SPA, you have two ways to render it. One is the initial render, and one is coming from any other route. And actually, there's n ways, right? Because sometimes coming from other routes, things can be subtly different. We run into this with Ember all the time. So the architecture in Ember, we've come to this pattern where it's like you have to have all of the data dependencies in one place because there's n ways to get there, and that has to be the central logic that makes sure I've got the data I need to render this page, or else you're just going to you're going to get hosed, So the back to the GraphQL stuff, you have like a user with subscribe channels and then a channel. Now that sounds familiar to me because I'm used to doing like the kind of domain modeling from the Rails side and the has one, has many, many. Did you choose that? Like I know GraphQL is very flexible, right? You can kind of like choose how to link relationships up however you want. So were you just bringing that knowledge from your domain knowledge, like domain modeling experience in Rails, and just saying, this is going to be a user, this is going to be a channel, I need a join record, and just kind of enforcing those conventions on your own? Or were some of the tools that you were using, like in Phoenix, kind of nudging you in that direction? Or
I think it's probably, I mostly looked towards, how to organize my queries, kind of looking at the way Shopify does it, looking at the way GitHub does it, because I think they've gone through several iterations of trying to figure out the best way to expose relationships between things. As far as modeling on the back end, it's kind of the traditional data modeling techniques like
Postgres.
Yep, Postgres. And
those are going to be three different tables. Foreign keys.
Yep. I have ecto models to represent those things, and you can do the many type relationships in kind of when you're declaring your schema there, similar to what you do in Active Record.
Right.
So all that was pretty well understood. The part that's less well understood is like sometimes it's not entirely clear whether you should be exposing that join model, because so to use an example, like I have users, but then I have teams, and there's kind of this intermediary team user, and that's actually something that I would argue deserves to be represented and not just abstracted away, because a team user can be, for example, revoked access, but you still have posts from them, and you still want to be able to see like at least a snapshot of what their display name used to be when they were a member. So there's some.
Yeah, our experience in Ember is very, very similar to that, where it's like I don't need this, and then you need to do some CRUD-op on it, and you're like, crap.
Right.
Or like a relationship between a user and a team user and a channel. They have a certain subscription level. So there's you can be fully subscribed, or you can be just normal subscribed, or you can be watching, which is a different level. And so there's additional properties around the relationship that kind of need to be representable from both angles. Right. So it didn't really make sense to put those fields on either the group or the user because it was a many-to-many. So
it was an aspect of the actual relationship.
Right.
It's like the appointments, doctors, patients case, where the doctor has many patients through doctor patients. But really, what is a doctor patient? It's actually like an appointment.
Yeah.
And appointments have times, and it's the same. Yeah. So in Ember, we actually have the same. We have team users in EmberMap as well. Yeah. And we found sometimes it's nice to avoid the join record when you're just reading the has many. Yeah. But as soon as you need a credit, it makes sense to just have it as a full-blown model. Yeah. Everything's conventional. Yeah. You're not like trying to push something onto an array and then like save the array with all the IDs. Right. You just have the join record that has the 2 foreign keys, and like it's much simpler. Yeah. So that's cool. Here are the similarities. Yeah. So the domain model from the back end is kind of traditional, like it would look familiar to us. Yeah. And then to actually get it into GraphQL, is there like a lot of duplication there? Like how does that look? Because the query is going to be basically, one to many to many. Yeah. And what was the work involved using your tools to get the GraphQL thing to actually do that? Yeah,
so for standard cases where like you just want to expose, say, in your query, you want to query for a user, and maybe you want to be able to look up a user by ID. So you can just say at the top level, query for user, and then you can have arguments. So I can say user with ID of 1 or whatever, and then to declare that in the DSL, you just say, for that case, you would define a resolver. So you would tell GraphQL, what do I need to do to look up this user? And so then you just map that to, in Phoenix, I have a user's context where I have a function of like something like users.getUser, pass it an ID. So you just basically, give the GraphQL schema definition a function to call when that query gets run. And when you say like when you're declaring that user object, you tell it explicitly which fields you want to expose. So maybe some like columns in the user table are not
passwords
things that exactly. Maybe I don't know. Maybe. So like you explicitly declare which things you want to expose, and you tell GraphQL which type this is going to be. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be an ID or a string or a Boolean or whatever. Mm-hmm. And but that's not that's not too much work. It's
pretty lightweight. But it's nice to have the abstraction point across your models between that and your API.
Right.
How do you like, one thing we've noticed when we're like fetching single records, we have something similar to that. But then when we're fetching like graphs of data or included data, we found it's easy to get us into a spot where we're like n+1 egg. So how do you what do you do in those situations?
So that's so there's a helper for that helps batch queries called data loader, and so it kind of makes defining the resolvers a little bit trickier. But basically, anytime I have a resolver that needs to look up a record, I'm always using a data loader resolver, and what that does is basically defers the lookup until the point where the whole entire query has been assembled, and then it runs the query for all of the records of that type. So if
I be intelligent about joins, for example,
right? So if I have, say, what's a good example? Say like I have a channel and it has an owner or something like that. So I had like an owner ID that's stored on the channel. Then the data loader resolver would know that this owner ID, it maps to some user. So I want to defer the lookup of this. And so if I'm looking up a list of channels and I want all their owners, then what the resolver will do is it'll look up all the channels, and then it'll build an array of all those owner IDs, and then it'll make one query for users where ID is in this array.
So kind of like what was there's like includes or eager load in Rails. Very cool.
Right, and so it can do that layers deep. So you can get in the scenario, I suppose, if you had like an owner and then you want owners, I don't know, friends or something like that. Like you could end up having multiple queries for users as it crawls through. But I think it batches it up as best it can.
It prevents the n+1 in most cases.
Yeah.
Do you ever think like, oh, I should keep my payload small, like to avoid like those tricky things, or are you always just like, yeah, I'm just going to request what I need?
So I'm starting out with just requesting what I need, but one benefit of kind of maintaining more state in the client is like right now, because my teams are small enough, I'm going ahead and fetching all the members of a team, right? And just keeping all those. Yeah. So now anytime I'm looking up things where like I know I'm already going to have that in memory, I don't have to request it in those queries. I can just ask for its ID and only get the ID back, and then look it up in the local cache. Yeah.
Yeah, we do that pattern a lot, and it's nice a way to like punt on making more complex data loading stuff. Like an EmberMap series has at most 12 videos, so you just visit the page, you have them all in the cache, and then you can click around and no more data requests. Yep. It's nice.
Just wait till you get your first team with 100 users.
Yeah, exactly.
I
Good
feel
problem
like
and a bad problem.
I feel like I need to start a doc somewhere where that's like unscalable things I've done. because you kind of, at a certain point when you're building products, especially when you're trying to build an MVP, it's like, I can't afford to worry too much about the scenario where I have 1,000 users, but this will not scale infinitely.
But at least you. But I think there's a balance here, and you chose a fundamental technology that is like the right tool for the job, right? It's messaging, like you were saying before, Elixir and everything. Yeah. So the Elixir API and the GraphQL layer, have those felt pretty good? Like of the three pieces that kind of Elixir, like learning about how they do domain modeling and all the Rails idioms in Phoenix, and then the GraphQL stuff, and then the Elm stuff. Like, what's the percentage effort and like difficulty, and which is the easiest?
That's a great question. I feel like I spend most of my time in the Elm world. It's funny, the Elixir and GraphQL parts have felt very routine, actually. Things get interesting when, like I was building the system that would send out push notifications when it needs to, and so to do that, you're storing basically a URL that is given out by a browser when someone like authorizes push notifications, and so I'm storing that in the database, and then so certain things like you create a post, and then in the background you don't want this to block the main thread, but in the background you want to look up all the different URLs that you need to post to, and then you need to do that like in a gen server so that it's all asynchronous and with some retry logic, and like things like that are fun little problems that I had to solve and like dig into some of the Elixir, patterns and stuff. Yeah. But for the most part, it's like pretty much CRUD, like reading stuff out of the database, putting it back in, building database transactions where it makes sense. And all that has felt pretty routine. And it's been a joy building the GraphQL API because the DSL is so nice. Yeah. I have testing it has been interesting. Like I've steered mostly towards trying to make sure I have enough test coverage to feel comfortable that like as I'm adding different connections to GraphQL queries that it's returning the right things. But it is hard because unlike a REST API where it's very predictable, you give it this URL, you expect this type of data back in this exact shape, you can throw anything at GraphQL. So there have been a few times where like a little, I don't know,
something slipped by.
Yeah, or something stupid I did, like not aliasing a module properly, and like it didn't throw the exception I expected somewhere deep in the GraphQL resolution, and was getting nulls back for something. And, but aside from little things like that, it's been really smooth.
Yeah. How do you test like the GraphQL stuff? Is it like a request HTTP test, or do you do like the resolver at the resolver level?
I mostly just stick to HTTP requests, hitting the I've just become a fan of doing it
outside in basically.
Yeah, at the level where the actual calls are going to be made.
Right. Yeah. Nice. Resolver is basically implementation detail of the actual API stuff.
Right.
Yeah, we use JSON API in most of our apps, and it has some similar aspects of GraphQL where you can fetch different graphs using the includes parameter, and it's the same thing. Like the trickiest parts are like you introduce a new resource that has a link to another one, and all of a sudden someone can get at a resource that they weren't supposed to. So then you add kind of an off layer at the outside so that you have to verify everything in the payload. But thinking in graph, it gets so complex so fast. Like you add one new node and one new connection, and then boom, like there's like 10 things you actually didn't consider,
And that's the other cool thing about kind of the data loader layer. It asks you to basically define like a an authorization, a query that does proper authorization checking. So it always has like current user in context. So that's at the moment where you're telling data loader, like, this is the query you're going to run to do this batched lookup. At that moment, you can say, like, only give me back, like, make sure the query is restricted such that it can't query for records that I'm not allowed to see.
Interesting.
So it's like current user dot channels dot where IDs.
Right.
Very cool.
Right.
Very cool.
Yeah. And so that does help because it always funnels, like, data loader knows, like, if I'm looking up a user, I'm gonna check this function and ask it for a base query, basically, that I can build on top of, but a base query that we know will never return records that you're not authorized to see. And so that does help, because otherwise, it's real easy to get in a scenario where you've got just the wrong cocktail of chain of things, and now it's like looking up by ID freely.
Right.
Which is,
right.
Yeah.
The last comment I want to make about what you just said, and we can get into kind of talking about Elm, was you said, like, most of it is kind of routine. Once you build, we built, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 like kind of bigger Ember apps, and once you do that 6 times, you are kind of like, the back end is actually kind of it's almost feeling like a commodity. It almost feels like you shouldn't be writing the code because it's so rote.
Routine, I think you said,
Yeah. So our vision, our dream as people who work on a lot of SPAs is, like, if that could just be abstracted away, and you wouldn't even have to do it. Yeah. So just if someone could build, like, a GraphQL hosted service that does an N+1 and lets you do all that cool stuff, you could just, how cool would it be if you could just build the Elm app and just think about it as that?
Yeah.
And
I haven't looked into it much, but I know, like, somewhere in Amazon Web Services 1,000 tools, there's, like, a GraphQL service.
There is. It's called Amplify. It's, like, buried way. I look at this. Like, every 6 months. It's like I have to check on it. I have to, and you just scroll through these docs, and it's just like, the AWS docs. It's just
They really don't. They don't get it. Like, they just don't. People judge a book by its cover, and they just don't get it.
It looks so cool too. It's just They, like, provide, like, React components for, like, auth, and, like, wow, like, this is, like, could be really cool.
Yeah, it's an interesting strategy. It's just like a barrage of stuff they're building, which, and the good stuff does surface, and it's like, eventually you find it when you need it the most. You're like, I've got to scale this API, and Amazon's like, I've got something for you.
We made a button, and all you have to do is press it. So you just have to find where the button is.
Right.
Cool. So let's start talking about Elm.
Yeah.
And maybe we can just kind of segue from the last conversation. So basically, you have your GraphQL query, and you have a user with many subscribe channels, and then also the channel there, and that's going to give you everything you need to paint that part of the screen.
Yeah.
So you said you started just by doing, like, the full page refresh, essentially, because that's, like, the safest and fastest way to get going. Would you literally just take? Now, how does the JSON get from the query? So the query comes back, there's a response, and it looks like a JSON payload, right?
Yep.
It's not like any sort of weird encoded type.
No, it is JSON. It's JSON.
It's JSON.
Yep.
And it's going to look like the query does.
Yep.
How does that get onto the screen?
Yeah. Okay. So first layer is I have a module for each of the, like, types of queries I want to execute, and queries can have variables too. So you can, when you're running a GraphQL query, you're providing the query document itself and the JSON object with whatever variables you want to send with it. So you can kind of build more generic queries, like the query that fetches posts, for example. I would have my parameterize the pagination variables.
Or the channel ID or something
like that.
ID. Yeah, I see. Yep. So it's like query.execute param, so something like that.
Right. So I have a module for that where I kind of have my logic for the query document itself, and the kind of the function for sending the request to the Elm runtime, so that the Elm runtime makes the request, and it comes back to an update function in Elm, and then I take that and I run it through a JSON decoder. And so that's kind of a lot of people really dislike JSON decoders in Elm, partially because they kind of twist your mind around a little bit. But once you understand them, they're actually really powerful. Because what it'll do is you specify exactly how you want to decode what came in and basically map the JSON to some kind of Elm type.
Interesting. So maybe walk through it with like a simple example. Let's say you have a user with a first name that's a string and an age that's a number.
Yeah. So you would say, say you have a user record in Elm, which is basically just like a map kind of.
And it's kind of like a model, like you would have.
Right.
And so it's going to have the same schema that your backend does or that your GraphQL is exposing. So it's going to be hard-coded in the Elm code.
Right. So I have a separate module called user. And that user has, under the covers, it's a record that has 2 fields, name and age, right? What we said?
Yep, string and number.
Yep, string and number. So you have that defined, and then your decoder is going to look something like, you're going to say decode.map to user. So you have, you're saying you want to map it to this type, and then, or you're going to say map to because you have two different fields you're mapping, and then you say, okay, this is a field, and you could say if it's like nested somewhere deeply, that's fine. You can say decode at, and then provide like an array with path basically. Cool. And so you say decode at path, and then which decoder do you want to use? So you'd be like decode.string. And that would be for your name. And then same thing for that, except it's for the age, except it's decode.int.
And that's going to take a JSON type and turn it into an Elm primitive.
Right.
So you could have, does JSON have Booleans, like plain text true and false? Or it does, right? Mm-hmm. But it doesn't have, let's say it doesn't have dates or something.
Right.
So you could have a decoder for like birthday, and it would take the string representation in JSON and make sure it ends up as the primitive type in Elm.
Exactly. So for things like that, it's really cool. You can say, decode this first as a string, and then, so you write your own decoder basically. You can say decode as a string and then chain another decoder onto that, where you pass it a function that takes the string that it decoded and returns the type that you want. Mm-hmm. So you can do your own, embed your own logic basically. Mm-hmm. And so, Elm released a time library that's kind of part of the standard under the Elm namespace.
Beautiful.
And
to have a first party.
Yeah.
I mean, how lucky, right?
Yeah.
How unlucky as JavaScript developers. Right. I mean, really, it sounds simple, but.
Yeah. And it was nice because they put a lot of thought into like time zones. Like, do we store this as in like irrespective of time zones or with time zone data? Like, they kind of put a lot of thought into it. Evan did. So, anyways, so I have one that decodes dates, and there's not like a native decoder for it, but I could just, say like, if I'm expecting this in, timestamp, Unix timestamp format or ISO 8601 or however I'm, sending it through the API, then I can like build my own logic to map that into a time type.
I see. Yeah, we have something similar in Ember where you can say like an attribute is a string, or you can make your own. It's like a transform. Yeah. But this seems like a kind of important part here because this is like Elm is typed.
Yeah.
And JSON is like can be anything. So I imagine you can get type errors here. Like your GraphQL, your API could respond with something that's not actually valid.
Right. So if your API does that, then basically decoding a JSON object in Elm always returns a result type. And a result type has two possible branches. It's either okay or it's an error. Okay. And so
you're always working. Yeah, you're always working with type. It's not like an error if you send. It's not an exception.
It's not an exception.
It's not an exception.
So anytime. So if I've just done, if I've just decoded something, I have to have a case statement there, and it's either the okay scenario or the error case.
So can you explain that? Because I don't have a lot of experience with languages like this. Yeah. Is it just that? Is it nudging you to handle that, or is it literally impossible to compile the program unless you have a branch of logic?
It is literally impossible. Now you can choose
so
to.
Cool.
Yeah. It's really nice. I mean, it can be frustrating if you're used to, like I used to do really like kind of build things incrementally and like I know this part's gonna be totally broken, but I want to like refresh the page and see this come along.
Like the happy path, just get that working and then deal with other stuff.
And now, like, so you can do things like just match the okay scenario and then do something evil, like match all other scenarios with an underscore and just swallow it. Which I will admit, there are parts of the code base where like I'm not expecting this to fail, and if it does fail, like
It's something you haven't thought of.
yeah.
But you're still writing something, and it's still not going to give you a runtime error that's going to break your app.
Right. So you either like I have a choice then to either like display some kind of flash message that's like, something unexpected happened,
Right.
or you just kind of some things you just let them ride and you just
Hope the rest of your program can recover without any hit to your like business logic.
right. But it's just it's such a cool thing to be forced to think about that in all scenarios. And I found after spending a lot of time in Elm going back to Elixir, I mean, like I know there's edge cases all over here that I'm just probably not handling
Because the compiler doesn't have your back.
Right.
It's really cool that you do have to think about it, because I'm trying to think in like JavaScript, we would just like wrap stuff in try catch, but we're not really thinking about it. It would be like because of a bug report.
Yeah.
But this like you're always like finding that path through the code.
Yeah. And so what I found is that this generally surfaces like if something's wrong, it's going to
cause you problems
Yeah.
eventually. So it's actually better to deal with it up front.
Yeah. But like it's harder for wrong things to slip by. And like so if I accidentally break the contract with the GraphQL API, then I'm usually going to discover that pretty quickly.
So when that happens, what is it like?
So like if say like I screwed up a type on a post, or if I'm fetching a channel, then like that channel would just like, well, depending on how I'm handling there, either a flash message displays or it's just like missing. It's just not there.
Right.
The other case, and we can dig a little deeper into how I'm like storing data and stuff like that.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
sometimes it'll like when I'm rendering a page, I'm basically saying like I want to resolve all the data I need out of my local storage. It's just in the Elm model. And if I'm unable to get all that stuff, then the page is unrenderable. And so it's basically like
That is awesome.
Yeah.
I am so jealous because we get a partial render and then AJAX requests get made and content starts popping in.
Right.
That is really cool.
Wait, I feel like I missed something here. So walk me through an example in one of our apps. Or just the idea.
Yeah, in our training exercise where you go to like news stories and they're not loaded.
Yeah.
You're forcing your Elm app to render from cache.
yeah.
So if data's missing, you get an error. With us, if data's missing, we make AJAX across.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Just to know all that statically.
Right.
Because that is the stuff that gets hard as you build out an SPA, because you're going to have partial subsets of the graph needed for a page already in the cache.
Yeah.
You're going to want to render from cache as much as possible to keep things snappy, and then you're just going to be in a situation where you have like 80% of your graph and you need to like, how do you fetch the rest? Do I refetch it? Or like maybe you haven't thought about it and you thought you had everything, but you were missing this other part, and so you just partially render the page.
Yeah.
Do you when you're like writing these pages, do you have like a mental model of like I'm always going to render from cache, and you like separate the
that I was going to ask that. So basically, like you have the JSON, you decode it, and you're kind of hydrating models in a sense.
Yeah.
So then you're always working with models.
Yeah, so this is the kind of the realization that emerged. I had breakfast with Richard Feldman. He came into town. He was speaking at
Pretty good.
giving a talk somewhere or something, and I picked his brain about this. This was a few months after MicroConf, and I think we were talking about this very issue of like the identity map and what is the best way to kind of like store this data that you're fetching, for example, users often. Like you're getting authors of posts, and you're also doing showing a list of users. So like you're getting duplicate data back all the time.
Right.
And are you storing duplicate data in all these places, or are you putting it in one place?
Normalizing it and putting it in one place. Yeah.
And so I picked Richard's brain about this, and he kind of set me off on this path that ultimately worked really well. And so basically I have a dictionary it's like a data structure that has dictionary for each type, for each record.
It's like your database.
Yep.
And each thing is like a table.
Like a table.
And it's normalized.
Right.
And it's an identity map.
Yep.
So user ID 1 is in there, and if user ID 1 comes back again from the back end, you're going to overwrite, you're going to merge it into that, and you're going to render from that.
Yep.
And that's what you do.
Right.
So that's how the data gets from there to the page, is it goes through this dictionary.
Yeah. So to give an example, like between relationships, like on say a post, I'm storing an author ID, and so when I'm asking GraphQL for a post, it's giving me back the author and it's embedding it. It's giving me back the post and it's embedding the author in the response. But when I decode that into like my post
Data structure.
yeah. It doesn't. It just has the ID part in that, and it's also like when I do the decoding, it's in two phases basically. I say, okay, if I'm decoding a post, I get back this decoder post that has its relationship IDs in it, but then I also decode the related objects, and I kind of hold those up in a data structure and merge that into my store. And so then when it's time to display a post, I say, okay, I have this post, and I have this kind of enhanced type called like a resolved post. And so
it's like post from store, basically.
Yep. So then that resolved post becomes, well, it gives me back the post, and then I also have the author and any other related things that were stored as IDs, and they're all fetched out. So if any of those things are missing, then that post is unresolvable, and then that percolates up. Like if I'm trying to display that post on a page, it's like, well, we don't have all the data.
Anything for any of its relationships or any of the relationships needed to render the current page?
Well, I'm just using the example of like, if I'm like viewing a full screen post. So the page is just for viewing a post. You know? I will say like I need to get back the fully resolved version of this post, which means the post and its author and whatever else. And so if the author is not present, the author should be present, because when I fetched the post, it came with the author.
Because you made that query.
Yeah.
So if it's not there, you made a mistake somewhere.
Right.
On the data loading side.
Right. And so then when I'm like, I need to be able to pass this resolved post to my view function so that it can display the author's name and have all the data.
Right.
And if it doesn't have that, I have some choices to make. I can either just crash the page.
Right.
Or if it's expected that it won't be there, then I could do a lazy lookup and fetch it.
Right.
But,
Cool.
So the post, let's say a post belongs to an author and it has many comments.
Yeah.
The page just needs the post and the author.
Yeah.
So if the post was in the store and the author was in the store but the comments weren't, would that be okay? Or do you have it coded to where like you expect right now, the way the app is, every pointer needs to be loaded?
Yeah. So the way I'm handling that, so there's cases where the ID is stored directly on it, like an author, the author ID is stored on a post.
Yep.
And then there's cases where, it may have, 200 replies.
Yep.
And maybe I only have the most recent few loaded. Maybe I have none of them loaded.
Yep.
So what I'm doing then in that case is I'm looking in my local store and saying, give me all replies with a post ID of this.
Yep.
Sorted by timestamp and limit however many I want to display.
Right.
And if I want to be sure that I have the most recent, then I'll be also making a back channel request for the most recent replies.
So what does the API look like? How do you express that I need a post and its author, and if you don't have those, then like fail? What is the actual, whatever the entering point is for the render function essentially?
Yeah.
What does the code look like?
So in that case, I'm looking first, trying to look up the post out of my local store.
So you have like store dot.
Yeah. So it's like ultimately what's happening is it's doing a lookup in a Elm dictionary where it's a mapping of ID to post, right? And anytime you do a lookup by the key, it returns back a maybe type, which is just like a maybe is either it exists or it's nothing.
A resolve post or
a
nothing.
And so that's a built-in primitive into Elm.
So if it doesn't have the resolved author, you're going to get back a nothing?
Yeah, well, first of all, if it doesn't have the post, if the post is not in there, that will be nothing. And so then my function where I'm trying to resolve the post would fail. Would return a nothing.
Right.
But if the post exists, then great, we have the post. Now I look at the author ID and I do a dictionary lookup essentially for that user. And if that user is not there, then we have a failure.
So who's doing the lookup for the author? Is it in the top of the page's render thing, or is it on like the method of the store when you do like basically store.find post one or something like that?
Yeah, it's happening. So there's my store I just have like kind of a public API on that module that knows how. So I have like a get user function in that module, and I pass it the store, and I pass it an ID, and it returns a maybe user.
Yeah. Okay, so you have a store object, and you implement like a get post method, essentially.
Yeah.
And in that method, you're gonna look up the right post on your dictionary, and then you're also within that method gonna go try to get the.
So they're two separate lookups.
Yeah.
And that function is living in my page initialization logic.
Oh,
basically.
okay.
Yeah.
So it is based on the page.
Yes.
So you could have a logic for one page that says I need post, and that's all I need, and then another page that says I need post, and I also need its author, and I need its comments.
Yep.
And those are going to be declared on the separate page level.
Yep.
Nice.
Exactly.
That's great.
Yeah. And so you can imagine for each page, there's a certain amount of shared state, like the list of channels on the sidebar. And so every page that has that, with the exception of maybe a few that are like higher level and don't show that, are going to do, part of their resolving all the data needed is going to do a, lookup in the store for channels where, the team ID is whatever team you're looking at.
Right. Cool.
Yeah.
So the store worked out.
It worked out.
Yeah. We have a similar pattern we use, and it's it definitely feels like one of the best decisions kind of in the Ember architecture.
Yeah.
And you just start thinking in terms of the store, really. And then also when you get to the parts where you're like, we need to get new data, even though the user's not entering the route for the first time, you really just think about like hydrating the store separate from rendering. And I'm imagining that based on the way the model and the view layer work in Elm, if you were to update the store, the view would just kind of automatically re-render.
Exactly.
And so you have that built into the architecture, and you can be very declarative about what data is needed for the page. And then the question of how the user moves around the app and how the data gets in the store become disentangled.
Yes.
Which is like very powerful.
Yeah.
I imagine this is pretty important for messaging, communication.
Totally. Yeah. And the other piece there is that you're right. Someone else could post a message that should be displayed on your screen at that moment. And so GraphQL subscriptions is kind of the piece that basically uses WebSockets to subscribe to certain changes.
Interesting.
And then that data basically flows into the store. And then there's also like an event that, of each page can be notified of that event occurring. Like if a post created event happened, post created comes down, and with it carries the post. So when you're at the top level, when I'm intercepting that event, I decode the post, throw it in the store, and then let the current page know that, hey, a post was created. If you're interested, you can change your own page state, or maybe that's not required. Maybe it's just automatically happens because you're
rendering from the store. You have like a live
Right.
binding to the store.
Right.
Interesting.
There is like, in that example, when I'm listing posts, one problem I ran into was I was originally live binding to the store.
Yeah.
But then if someone was like looking at a post and no one came in, the page would shift out from under you.
Yep.
So what I started to do was maintain kind of like a list of IDs that represents the current post set. And then when a new one comes in, that data structure I had it like a little queue, like a list where it's like things would queue up. So now if a new thing comes in, it goes into the queue, not into the main list, and a little pop-up display saying there's one new post to show.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Very, very cool. We've been thinking about this in terms of how can we represent, like, show me all posts since at the time that I loaded the page.
Yeah.
And then there'd be like a filter on the post. It's
Right.
like filter by post created after.
Yeah, that'd be another way to do it.
It's
Though.
like-
That's interesting.
Because we try to think about what's the declare. When you start doing this a lot, again, you just get to this point where you're like, I really just want to declare what data is shown here.
Yeah.
And so you first start building this page, and you're like, store.findAllPost. But then you realize that actually doesn't contain all the information needed to express. That's actually not the full business logic expression of the page. Because if you were talking to a product manager about this, and they would say, oh, all the posts, right? And then you show them this, and then it starts updating every time.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, actually, it's not all the posts. Like the business logic is, as of the time when the user visits the page, show me all the latest 20 posts.
Yeah.
And then, oh, there's this other piece of UI right here, which is if it's been a minute and there's at least 2 new posts, show a notification.
Yeah.
That's actually like a separate query, which is like the client actually needs to know what the latest post is,
Yeah.
so they can compare it to the first post in that other query. And that's the data you would need to show that UI,
Yeah.
at which point you could just rerun the first query as if they were to load the page.
So in that case, do you have like you have some kind of timer running, basically that.
Well, ideally, you are able to declare the data needed, the query,
Yeah.
and then the question of, if you have WebSockets, you could just always be hydrating those queries.
Right. So that would,
So if
every
you
time
can-
that would happen, it would trigger kind of a reevaluation of what,
Yeah.
what should be displayed.
If you
and-
if you have an expressive enough way to write the query that includes
Yeah.
like that timestamp, then it should just be fresh all the time.
Yeah.
You should be able to fully describe your UI as if you were hooked directly into the backend.
Right.
As if the backend was directly on your client. And if you're able to segment the data in that way, then you can just say, now the question of like hydrating the data or refetching those queries is like a non-issue. So we've talked a lot about this because we run into all the same problems.
Yeah.
Talking about like, you could also have a notion of like a query becoming stale. So you could say like, here's the query, expires in 5 minutes. So if any part of the app asks for this query, just render it from cache. Otherwise, as soon as it's stale, even if the user's not doing anything, then just go ahead and rerun
Right.
it.
Yeah.
So it's really fun to think of like what the higher level declarative APIs are, that if you could snap your fingers and have them, it would just like simplify this stuff.
Yeah.
Because you would just declare the data needs, the tooling would take care of all this stuff,
Yeah.
and you wouldn't have to like worry about it. Because like, yeah, if a new piece of data shows up in the store, it's fine because like I fully described my data needs.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like another challenging piece with having a UI that stays so in sync with backend state is like, I've run into this with like new message tracking, like unread. So I want to show like when a reply comes in and it's unread, I want to have an indicator on that. But just relying on unread state, like as soon as it appears visible to the user, it's marked as read. And the UI is so responsive that it's basically a flicker.
Oh yeah.
And then the unread indicator is gone because it's no longer unread.
Right.
So that I think a timestamp could help in that scenario too, of like, unread since the last time viewed or something like that. Or
Interesting.
I'm not sure exactly the best
How
way.
you would express it.
Yeah.
It's unread if there's a message in the store that's been there for at least 15 seconds
Yeah.
and you haven't seen it.
Yeah.
And if that's, you can always run that thing, that
Right.
query, if you could always run that and then unread, if that's true, then you would display the unread indicator.
If you haven't seen it, is really tricky because you could just have your computer open and walk out of the room,
Right.
and it would be seen
Seen.
for 15 seconds. So there's like almost like this like user interaction
Right.
logic or
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But let's assume you could hand wave away that problem. I think that's an interesting one. I haven't actually, so when we talk about this, what we usually do is talk about Twitter because it's exactly the same case as Level, where you have a feed of things. And originally, if you were building this, especially if you were building this in like a Rails app, you would say like tweet.all and render it. But actually, you don't want all the tweets because if you literally were rendering all the tweets, it would just every new tweet would come in, you wouldn't really read anything.
Yeah.
So it's really tweet as of the time the user requested the data.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing about and so you have that as the feed, and then you do want to show the see new tweets button, so you have a second query basally.
Yeah.
That's kind of what we were just talked about.
Yeah.
So Twitter.com is a really good use case to think through. If you had to build that as an SPA, how would you describe the data needs?
Yeah.
This is another good point about this is like, how we started this conversation saying what is like a hallmark of an SPA is that it actually is not loading data based on the current client interaction.
Right.
Like you have a client open the app and them moving around the app is not what determines how and when the data is loaded.
Yeah.
They're separate.
Yeah.
But then sometimes like it actually does matter. Like when you first render the channel or the homepage of Twitter, that's actually an important thing. But conceptually they're still separate.
Right.
And you want to think about them separately for all these reasons. So
Yeah.
pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, and one of the challenges that I'm working through right now, and you might have some insights about this, I'd actually be curious to hear. Like, so this store you have on the front end, I mean, it can't it's probably not feasible at a certain point to have all the data from the team, like all the posts that are visible to you, right?
Yep.
Like in a perfect world, I would just download all of it and
Right.
it'd all be there.
Right.
So basically what we're doing is now trying to have the right subsets of the data to show, right? Where it's kind of like edges of the data set that are relevant. So like for each channel, it'd be nice to have the top 20 posts, you know. But I don't want to, there's always a balance of like how much to eager load, preload, and how much to do on the fly. And it's kind of tricky to know now, like I'm not getting a lot built in. This data store is very much kind of just using primitive types under the covers. So it's not doing a lot of magic on it. It's not doing any magic for me under the covers. So it's up to me to determine, like when I load a page, some of the posts are coming out of the store. And then if I'm fetching some more recent posts, those are maybe, you know, the latest coming from the server just to make sure I have the latest. And now I kind of have this commingling of data. Like there may be an older post that's in the store.
That's not for the current page. It just happens to be in the store.
Or it's for the current page, but maybe it's like way older than the
Stale?
top 20 or
Oh,
so, or
okay.
it's like
I see.
So there'd be like a gap.
A gap in
so
the
there's
page,
some kind of
let's
gap.
say. Yeah.
So I've run into this where like you know, the pagination logic. I have a bug right now actually where like it'll load some, you know, recent posts and there'll be like an old post right here,
Yep.
and I have to not key off of that. Like if someone hits the load more button,
It's going to be wrong.
it's keying off of that. So
Yep.
now there's a gap.
Yep.
And so
Yep.
it's like, I guess I need to know what came from the server versus what came out of the store.
Yep.
I don't know. How do you deal with that?
So
You want to express each message as in like, I should only be rendered if I know the message above me and like fetched its next message. If you like thought of it as like your pagination was only one,
yeah.
I think you would think in terms of something like that.
Well, usually the way we solve this too is like, how do you just talk about it with us right now? Like, what's the bug there, right?
Yeah.
The bug is like, you don't want to show, what would you say? It's like, you only want, what's the actual logic? What should happen when you go to announcements?
Well, it should show the latest, the top
10 messages.
top 10, and then
As of the time the user visits the channel.
as of the time they visit the channel, and right now there's just like a button at the bottom to fetch more, and so when clicked, there should be no gap.
So what happens when you have, because sometimes it's okay to show stale data, and sometimes you want to say, I'd never want to show stale data.
Yeah.
So this might be one of those times where like the channel list changes so infrequently
Right.
that like, let's say someone edited the like the name of general and like fixed a typo or something. But like if you had all the channels in cache, you'd rather render those for the users and do a background reload and just have it pop correctly.
Yep.
But maybe this is a case where what do you want the UX to be in the situation where you have 12 old posts and they click on announcements? Do you want to block and not show those and get the latest 10?
That's a good question.
Because that's like a product decision, right? It's like, what do you actually want to happen there?
I think honestly, the behavior would depend on how if they've been disconnected. So
Yep.
theoretically, if you've maintained a persistent WebSocket connection, you should have close to a complete representation
Right.
in memory. If there's been a gap, then it's questionable. I mean, it's always questionable. So I think it's acceptable if like one post, for whatever reason, the WebSocket message got lost in the ether.
Right.
And so when upon background refresh, like one slips
pops in.
It pops in. But that should be like the exception, not the rule.
So what if there's 10? There's a gap of 10? Like
Well-
what should the UX be?
Well,
Like you want to show the 12 old ones and then, yeah.
I think if I knew it was sufficiently stale, then I would want to have a logical path that said just wait, don't show anything.
So don't show the stale data.
Yeah.
So I think that's your answer. So I think you need to say something like, there's a threshold at which you're uncomfortable with how stale the data is.
Yeah.
So maybe this query, like maybe this data in the cache expires after 6 hours.
Yeah.
And if they have the app open, it's been 6 hours since they ever run the query for the announcements thing, then you basically throw it away.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have to get rid of it in the cache, but you block on the query. You would block rendering on the rerunning of the query.
Yeah.
So then you have a fresh query rendered, and then as far as like the gap goes, you could use like it's like a log, so you could see if the next thing is right after it or not. Probably be easier to just throw it away though to begin with.
Yeah.
And but yeah, it's something like that. That's
Yeah.
kind of how we usually think about these
Yeah.
problems. Is like there's some business logic that we haven't thought through and is not encoded in the data query.
Yeah.
And it usually fixes the problem.
Yeah.
So yeah, basically, like we've run into these problems. You run into these problems all the time because this is such a great example of the hidden complexity with stateful app development.
Yeah.
And it's like people can just kind of say that and like, oh, you get to like turn it off and on again every time with a server app. But like this is how it manifests itself. And the reality is that when you're building a page, you're thinking about how to do it from like initial render.
Yeah.
And you're not thinking about how this page is going to render if your app happens to be in all these other states.
Yeah.
Like you never build the announcements channel thinking, oh, well, what about when I have 12 kind of stale records in my store?
Right.
That's not occurring to you.
Right.
And if you take this to its conclusion, you're really building a distributed database.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what this thing looks like, and that's
Yeah.
hard problem.
I've leaned back in my office chair sometimes like, this is basically, I'm just synchronizing parts of my database. I mean, that's what it is. And it's good to, it's like, it gives me a lot of clarity to think of it that way, but also it's a little overwhelming when you start, and I like the incremental approach that I've taken. I think it was good. I do think it was good to start with like
naive render.
Assume nothing.
Yeah.
Assume you have no data.
Definitely.
And start to hold on to some of it between, but still like always refetch everything, and then piece by piece, like, all right, do I feel safe now? I kind of can see the flows here, see all like a lot of the entry points into this page. Do I feel safe like pulling this from the store?
Right.
And relying on that to be pretty reliable. So,
right.
Yeah.
To me, this totally points to like it's a tooling problem in the sense that like this should not be the concern of an application developer.
Yeah.
It should not. There should be an expressive enough way to say what the data for this page is and should be. In the event, should I show this if I am just have the cache data and I don't have fresh data from the server? And the tooling should be able to say, yep, it's a declarative thing, and I know I need to go reload it regardless of what you're doing. But it enables so many cool things, right? I mean, you can do offline stuff. You can have it be really fast when you navigate around the app because you don't have to block rendering every single time.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a need for higher level APIs to help developers here.
Yeah. Do you see Ember as, I mean, is the community aware of this problem and like heading in the direction of solving it? I mean, it's a huge problem, like to get to that point where ideally, like, where it's abstracted away from developer land. But do you see that happening?
There's some good developments in the Ember community for sure. Ember community has been building apps like this for a long time, so I think people have a lot of experience with it. It is a hard problem. Ember tries to help in some areas already, but this is a lot of like, we have some open source work that's focused on this because we feel like there's nothing quite out there yet that does what we.
Yeah, I think with Ember, like data has always been like kind of like a first class thing, and there's definitely like getting those like data loading APIs right, and then having like the identity map and normalizing data. I think one of the things that like in the early days of Ember that we didn't realize is just like we thought those APIs were like the active record APIs, like all posts or find by one or find by select, but it turns out there's like all posts as of when I fetch them, all posts on the server, like
non-stale posts or stale posts. So the problem space is way bigger than like the use case for. Although even the active record in a Rails app has to deal with this because you like in a complex controller method, you do like user.findOne_include or whatever, include posts, and then somewhere else tries to fetch a user, and an active record is going to try to say, oh, we've already loaded user one, so here, just return it. So you're dealing with the cache right there.
Yeah.
So you can save yourself from unnecessary trips to the database. And if you think about this, it's the same thing. It's like, I already have the channel list.
Yeah.
I don't need to wait every time to block and go get the channel list again.
Yeah.
There's something about the channel list that makes that true, and then there's something about the message list that makes that false.
Right.
But it just turns out that like, it's just way harder because you don't get as many resets. You don't get as many opportunities to punt on some logical error you have because you're starting from scratch each page render.
Yeah. But it feels it feels good right now to have all the flexibility. And what I like about this is that there's not there's not a lot of like black boxes in the way that I'm thinking about the architecture, which helps when I'm trying to reason about it. And if there was, I'm kind of thankful I don't have like a store, like there wasn't a store in Elm where like there's some magic going on in there.
No escape hatches.
Yeah. So, but I also feel like I'm doing a lot of low-level implementation of things. Like this doesn't feel like the future. Like there's something else there's some other layer there that's needed. But like, how do you do that in a way that's not
boxing you into a bad abstraction?
Right.
No escape hatch. Yeah, I think if we were to snap our fingers right now, Ember Data Store is a great starting point. It has the high-level stuff. You need a little bit more to be expressive and say like find all posts or like find all post as of this thing or find all post expires in 5 minutes. It would be nice to have that in there. But you also want to be able to drop down. And when you're dropping down, some of the things you want are like derived state or state that's on the store. Yeah. So for example, like when did I call find all?
Right.
And like that comes up, that ends up being something that you often want as a UI developer, like when you're dealing with a store like this. Or the last 3 queries that were run.
Give me a log of every query I've run, and then I can inspect that and figure out like, should I go refetch data?
Yes, that would be very useful as well. So I think that would be my ideal, to have those lower level escape hatches with like all of that state on, even snapshots of the user over time, because that's something else. Like when you're dealing with an identity map, and then you have like a draft and you start editing it. If it's rolling the changes into the store directly, everywhere the user is displayed has that reflected. And sometimes that's not what you want.
Right. You got a little avatar up in the corner and it
changes as you're
just
changing.
Typing.
Exactly. But sometimes it is what you want. And sometimes, when you read a message down here, you do want the unread indicator to be updated. So you want that UI to be derived from the same state. Sometimes you don't. So there's a project in Ember called Orbit, which is more like a log-based kind of thing, and it has this notion of like store forking, basically, which is also something that we've pined for in certain UI issues, where you could just fork the store. Yeah. Let's say you're doing a big form, and like your store becomes richer maybe than it is right now, where it's like dictionaries, but like now you have relationships you can access. You have computed properties, so you could have like a posts.comments count, and it's like post.comments.length or something like that. And when you're writing like a form where you're editing that stuff, you want those computed properties, but you don't want it to be the original. You want it to be like a draft version.
Right.
So you like fork the store, and then you start making edits, and then maybe you want to roll it back. So like there's something with like log-based and like versions of things, and having the state accessed that could be really, really powerful.
Yeah. What about too, like, I haven't dug too deeply into like true event sourcing, but I don't know if you've like kind of explored that pattern at all. But
that's like, again, when you deal with these like offline issues and like stale data. Yeah. If everything was just a series of events,
just a log. Yeah.
It's implemented as a log, but then it gets rolled up into a stateful snapshot. Yeah. And your store can always say, here's my latest index. What's the latest on the server? Now you can actually ask that question. Like if you went offline, you can say like what was the latest and how long has it been? And you can render like this was rendered as of 5 minutes ago or whatever. So many nice things from that. Yeah. So we like the OOP like layer on top, where you're like kind of user.find1, and like you can do user.comments, and it's like this object relational thing. I like thinking in that level. Yeah. But it's nice if it was implemented with something like event sourcing, because those facts end up being really useful for building UIs.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see. Like it's good to know that there's some work happening in the Ember community, because I want to see those projects and like kind of dig into what's happening, and maybe there's something I can do, kind of working on an eventual library that addresses this in Elm too. And I think like language communities can learn a lot from each other.
Absolutely.
And also I think there's a lot to learn from like desktop applications and phone applications.
Yep. I mean, that's kind of what I was talking with Adam about.
Yeah, that was a great talk. Yeah.
And it's kind of like, you are building client apps, and you want to think from the UI first, and then think about the data being driven by that, and go from there. So.
I mean, it is really great that I feel like we're past all like the JavaScript framework wars, where we're all having these problems,
the same problems.
We're all going to build on top of each other's work. So this is super exciting.
Yeah, it's good.
Cool. So man, there's so much more we could talk about. I think the data store is really interesting though, because whether you're using React or Vue or Ember, we feel like, and we've talked about this on our podcast a bunch, like developers aren't writing div.innerHTML anymore.
Right.
Like that whole notion of updating the DOM as a function of the current state has basically been successfully abstracted away.
Yeah.
Whether using Elm or any of the modern toolkits, which is lovely.
Yeah.
Because in Backbone days, like you had to implement your own render function.
Right.
It was a no-op, and you had to decide how to update things, and if things were changing, how to change them.
There's some of these shifts have happened that are kind of universally accepted.
Yes.
Like declarative rendering.
Yes.
And virtual DOMs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So then the question is like, when do we get declarative data fetching?
Yeah.
Where we get to declare our data needs, and we can be just as sure, we get the same guarantees that the data is going to be there when we need it, and we don't really care about all that in the same way that we can have the guarantees from a tool like React that the HTML is going to be representing of the state.
Yeah.
I think it'll be a day for sure.
Yeah.
But it's super interesting to think about, and also good to know that other UI developers are having the same problems that we are. And,
Yeah.
it's not just Ember developers who are pulling their hair out over this
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting. So that's like the model part of Elm, and then the Vue part is, I know Elm has its own syntax.
Yeah.
But pretty straightforward kind of mapping of HTML.
Pretty straightforward. There's the Elm HTML library, and it just gives you a bunch of functions that are named after HTML tags. So you get, and they pretty much all accept two lists. So the first list is the attributes. The second list is the children. So if you want to display, a div or say a paragraph with some text and it has a certain class, you would say P, and then the list brackets, and then if you want to put a class on it, you would say class, because there's a function defined called class from the HTML.attributes module, and then you pass that a string and you give it the class string, and then in the second array, if you want to output some text, there's a function called text that takes its string and that just outputs a text node.
Interesting.
And so it's great. Once you get used to the Elm syntax in general, which I think takes people a while.
It's different, yeah.
Get accustomed. There's significant white space, and so lots of indentation, and the Elm formatter is very opinionated, which I will say I've become a major proponent of automatic formatting in all languages.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
JavaScript communities, I feel like it has moved there too with Prettier and other ESLint and all that.
Yep. I just spun so many unnecessary wheels in the Ruby world, just arguing about double quotes and single quotes, and it's
let a tool decide.
Yeah.
That's cool. What about your CSS? What are you using for that?
So I'm using Tailwind.
Nice.
And I've looked a little bit at kind of the CSS in JavaScript kind of movement. I'm seeing that happening more and more, and there's a library for Elm that allows you to declare your styles in Elm and get kind of type support for things, and that could be interesting. But for now, it's just class and then all my utilities, and it's been fairly painless. And I think a lot of the motivation for CSS and JS seems to be like namespace, like scoping styles to specific components and stuff like that. And I feel like utilities in general are kind of you just
solve that problem in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yep, we feel the same. We love Tailwind.
Yeah.
And Adam keeps talking about doing this what would it look like in JavaScript, but it's beautiful that it's just CSS and it works in Elm, which is like another programming language, but you're still using Tailwind classes.
Right.
We use an Ember, you can use it in a Rails app, so there's something that's nice about that.
Yeah.
Lowest common denominator just being CSS classes.
Yeah.
And then, we got to wrap up here because we could just talk for the next 6
I
hours.
know.
But we got into it a little bit before, just hearing about how you do testing.
Yeah.
And, we talk about testing a lot. And that was one of the things I was interested to hear because, again, I don't really have experience with like a typed language.
Yeah.
And basically what you said is like, you've never felt as confident or that you've worked on a front end this robust, which I think says a lot about the architecture and the tooling that you're using.
Yeah. Yeah, and the testing story in Elm, there's Elm test library, and there's some libraries that allow you to make test your views basically and make assertions on given this particular model pass to my view, here's what I expect this selector to be present, and you can even say like when this, when this button is clicked, I expect this event to be sent to the Elm runtime. And so there's some like more I suppose like more unit testing facilities than anything else. And I think the community has kind of said like if you're doing more like integration testing across the whole the whole like page or whatever, then use a Selenium or something like that. And honestly, like part of me feels a little guilty about not like pushing deeper into like the testing things. But I've also, it's not proposed a problem to me yet.
I mean, if it's
like,
not a pain point,
yeah,
I think that's a good. That's how we would do it too.
Yeah.
I mean, we write lots of tests in our Ember code, and it's because of pain points in the past.
Yeah.
And they're solving real problems, and they just help.
Yep.
We feel more like they help us think through the business logic. But it's not because we feel like we need a certain amount of test coverage.
Yeah.
Or anything like that. It's just purely pragmatics.
Yep.
So if it's not a pain point of yours, then like the compiler does so much. You were kind of saying.
Yep.
If you already have type checking from your JSON payload to your models, right there. I mean, you're.
I mean that eliminates a whole bunch of our tests.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just because a lot of it is like, oh, once the data gets in, does it get on the page? Like
Right.
you're going through so many layers. You just want to do the outside, like given this payload, what does the page look like, so that you're making sure all these things work together.
Right.
But if the type system and the compiler are basically doing that for you in a lot of the ways, then
Yeah, it's doing. I was kind of surprised because I came from the Rails world where it's test, and I think a lot of that, multiple reasons for testing, right? Like testing guides good design. If it's testable code is well-designed code, is one kind of ethos, and then also like regression, catching regressions and things like that.
Right.
And I think I would ultimately like to have more of that regression coverage. Like if I expect a certain, blob of text to be displayed on this screen under this certain conditions, like just verify that someone didn't accidentally go nuke that line.
Right.
But yeah, in general, like it's been surprisingly painless, just relying on the compiler to do most of the correctness checking.
So you ever gonna do a dynamically typed language again?
Man, I wouldn't rule it out the back end. I am dynamic in Elixir. Right. But on the front end, I'm pretty well sold on this. Like just the level of confidence I feel in the code is pretty amazing. It'd be hard to go back from that.
It's always a great sign when you ask, would you use this again? And the answer is yes. It's like, that's like the real test,
Yeah. And also the fact that you do come from a Rails background and you understand testing and the value it provides, and to see that the tool takes care of so much of that for you is like pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, that was super fascinating. Thanks for giving us a glimpse into your tool set and talking about Level. It's awesome. I feel like we're gonna have another conversation in the future for sure.
I think so.
There's so much more that we could talk about.
I was telling you offline, I haven't delved this deep into a lot of this stuff for months. Like I've just been kind of in the trenches figuring this stuff out. So it feels good to get all this stuff out in the open and hear that
commiserate.
That there's
us SPA developers, man. We gotta stick together.
I know, right?
We have a hard job. There's a lot going on. This is like new territory.
Especially with progressive web apps. Like one more tangent. Like there's this lingering question: am I going to have to build a native set of native apps for Level? And
I would expect also like if your customers are coming from Slack, they're going to have that kind of expectation.
Yeah, for sure.
Push notifications and all that stuff.
Yeah, and part of it will be like, well, maybe it's the best practice for you not to have this on your phone to keep a healthy boundary between you and your work. But I mean, it's a stretch.
Don't talk to me, programmer. Don't tell me what's healthy. Right. I want to answer emails at midnight.
Right. Here's a copy of Deep Work.
Yeah.
But so there is that angle that will hopefully ease some of the demand.
Yeah.
But I mean, so I do have I've had mobile responsiveness in mind as I kind of build the UI, but I'm hoping that progressive web app technology continues to progress quickly, because already there's, I mean, in a recent version of Chrome, you can now on a desktop say install this like website, this progressive web app as like a native thing, and it kind of, I don't know exactly how it works, if it does like a lightweight, like similar to wrapping it in an Electron wrapper or something like that, and just like presents it as if it's a native application.
So no like Chrome from the browser.
That's what I think. I haven't actually looked at it, so I'm not positive, but I think that's basically what it does. Is it gives you like a native-ish experience, but it's actually just a PWA.
And you have you do have access to some of those APIs like push notifications for the camera or something like that.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that'd be pretty cool.
So I mean,
you might get to punt on it basically.
Right. It's early days for that, and I can't like just trying to get like service workers working on mobile is tricky, and especially on iOS, it's a lot of landmines there. But I don't know. It'll be interesting to see where the ecosystem, how it evolves, and if I have to take the plunge on multiple code bases, or if I could just get my Elm running in all the places. So we'll see.
Oh man, so much cool stuff to talk about. It's going to be so interesting to see what SPA development is like in like 5 years.
Yeah.
And see how much of this has been solved, or some powerful new abstractions or tools will come out, or if it's, that's what I'm hoping anyways.
Yeah, me too.
Cool, man. Well, Level is awesome. Love hearing about it on your podcast. Love reading about your progress on it, and it seems like something that you really believe in and that you think is important. So if folks want to kind of follow your journey and learn more about it, what should they do? Yeah,
so they should check out Art of Product Podcast. My co-host Ben and I, we're on two days a week right now, publishing schedule. So just like laying it all out there, the raw behind the scenes story of us both building our startups. And of course,
that's a great tagline.
Yeah.
What raw behind the scenes story of both of us building our startup. That's homepage right there.
It's really good. I'm going to slap that on the homepage.
It's really good. Actually. It's really good.
Yeah.
Because that's what it is. I mean, I listen to it and I love it. I absolutely love it.
Yeah. Thank you. So there's that, and then also of course level.app is the domain for the product, and you can reserve your username right now, and I'm getting dangerously close to starting to really open up more signups. So yeah, it's imminent. Could be in your hands. So yeah.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us this week, and thanks again, Derrick, for giving us some time. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you all next week.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.